Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And this morning I'm going to try to talk a little bit about France's empire between the two world wars. And the reason why I want to talk about this today is that most of the focus, particularly in the Anglophone world, apologies if you're listening to this from France, as I know at least one of my listeners is, most of the focus in the Anglophone world in terms of imperial history is on the British Empire. Obviously, the British Empire in the 20th century became, after 1919, the largest empire in world history, the largest kind of connected world system. Its decline is a constant source of discussion and debate. And as you'll know, if you listen to the last few podcasts, I've talked a lot about India. As really the most prized aspect of that empire, but then you have the four white dominions. I say white using the term of the time, but sort of white colonial dominated dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Again, a kind of a tier of the British Empire, which become essentially autonomous states in their own right in the mid-19th through to the 20th centuries. So there's an awful lot to say about that. But France's empire gets really quite ignored, and it's a very different creature. The French colonial empire runs on completely different ideas, which are rooted far deep into France's 19th and even 18th century past. These are revolutions essentially, ideas essentially, that emanate from the French Revolution. So it really is worth delving into a little bit. And the problems that the French Empire faces are similar to those faced by the British Empire in the interwar years, but there are markedly different responses. The wars of the 18th century and the Napoleonic Wars lasting up to 1815 that were conclusively won by a coalition of states featuring Britain left Britain as the supreme overseas colonial power for the rest of the 19th century. France's defeat in 1815 meant that the British Empire building project could continue for at least the next 3 or 4 decades without any rivalry. From the 1830s, France does begin to rebuild her colonial position in Africa in 1831 with the annexation of Algeria, the conquest of Algeria. And by the end of the 19th century, her empire is concentrated in North Africa, with Algeria and interventions in Morocco, along with Spain. In Central Africa, by the late 19th century, the flashpoint for imperial tensions between Britain and France is Sudan, at Fashoda, and also in Indochina, in what becomes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So those are the kind of the poles of the French Empire. It hadn't really evolved in quite the same way as the British Empire, and certainly it wasn't capable of generating the wealth that the British Empire was capable of generating. The involvement of the French Empire in the 18th century and the start of the 19th century in slavery had given them outposts in the Caribbean, places such as Haiti, and there was a Francophile West African coast where French slave traders took slaves for the Atlantic crossing. It really is overlooked sometimes, the role of France in the slave trade. Britain is obviously the chief villain in all of this, but it's not to say that France, the Netherlands, and the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal particularly, didn't have a key role to play, because they certainly did. Perhaps it's better to talk about there being a European slave trade in the 18th century. Anyway, By 1919, at the end of the First World War, the establishment of mandates over former German territories in Africa and Ottoman territories in the Middle East was a project carried out by both France and Great Britain, much to the dismay and annoyance of Woodrow Wilson. Though, in fairness, Wilson wasn't quite the liberal figure he's painted as being. He was less concerned with the rights of emergent peoples in, as he saw it, in the Middle East and Africa, as he was with self-determination in Europe. And his views on ethnic minorities within America, for example, are quite instructive on this subject. You know, he's quite the Southern Democrat and a racist as regards black Americans in his own right. So let's not go painting the man up to be something he's not. The deals made between Lloyd George and Clemenceau, particularly over Syria, what is now Iraq, Mesopotamia at the time, and the northern portion of Mesopotamia, where Mosul now was situated, were based around Lloyd George's expectation that oil would be found in that region. He demanded to be given Mosul and horse-traded influence in Syria in return. And then this is a really interesting part of the story. Clemenceau said, "You want Mosul? You shall have it," at the Paris Peace Conference, in return, obviously, for majority French influence in Syria. The reason why France wanted influence in Syria was interestingly historical. France had a long medieval Crusader past in Syria. The Crusader castles that you can find there, the Carac de Chevalier, assuming that's still in one piece, I suspect not, tragically, were built by the Knights Hospitaliers, French Crusader knights. So there was a deep Francophile past, medieval colonial past, within Syria. Also, French public, French national pride, France being mauled so badly in the First World War, demanded some kind of major gift, really, at the end of the war, and possession of Syria, a territory that is enormously, to think of it as a Muslim country is probably quite inaccurate. It is a kind of an enormously religiously diverse country with, Christians and Druze and Maronites and Alawites and Shia and Sunnis, and a whole different mix. There was an enormous amount of early Christian sites within Syria. So within the Catholic Christian population of France, this was quite popular and attractive. Bear in mind, France in 1919 was far more religiously switched on than Britain is. And Britain wanted Mosul for the oil, as discussed. So there, once Clemenceau finds out he's been done, he was distinctly unhappy on this score. So there were the development of the French Empire. Not to suggest that the development of the French Empire didn't have any commercial imperatives at all, because it certainly did, and I'll come to that in a moment. But there were other prevailing imperatives within French imperialism. Just as when you look at Britain and India in the second half of the 19th century, commercial considerations do start to lose out to colonial nation building, British Christian religious missionary activity, and the idea that that the British Empire, instead of being a large trading network, now had some kind of crusading zeal from the centre that there's some sort of colonial improvement of the savage races needed to be carried out with predictably limited and occasionally disastrous consequences. By 1918, Britain had a clearly definable world system in place in her empire, as I said previously, with British dominions having a very significant role during the war and at the Paris Peace Conference. Australian, Canadian, New Zealand and South African statesmen and generals have really quite significant decision-making power, and politicians like Lloyd George and Churchill deferred to men like sort of Jan Smuts, for example, for advice and guidance. And so it was almost as if you have a colonial, a white colonial coalition. Obviously, places such as India or Malaya are not treated with this degree of courtesy and consideration at all, and the Edwardian statesmen of Great Britain were quite overt in their racial distinctions. France hasn't got that same kind of imperial system at all. Instead of having this network based initially around trade and then loosely around this notion of building civilization, France was looking to export what it viewed as its own civic values of citizenship, of essentially the things that make one French, the values of the French Revolution, the Third Republic. And they looked upon colonial subjects who became well educated in places like Algeria or Indochina as what they called évolus, those who are essentially evolving. Again, it's inherently kind of patronising and paternalist and ultimately quite a racist notion that you could evolve from being Indo-Chinese into being a citizen of France. But it was attempting to the notion of a French imperium in the 19th and 20th centuries was about trying to convey citizenship of a greater France onto colonial subjects in much the way that Rome did. However, you get Indo-Chinese and Algerian and Senegalese and other indigenous peoples buying in to some extent to this proposition, making their way up the ladder of education, career and colonial service, only to realise that there is an unspoken barrier based around race and ethnicity, that if you are not a white French European, there's only so far you can climb. And this actually causes all sorts of instability within the French Empire. It means that there is a well-educated, organised and professional core of very disenchanted, disenfranchised people who are more receptive to revolutionary ideas, be they kind of Marxism or Marcus Garvey's brand of black nationalism at the end of the First World War, than they are to notions of liberty, equality and fraternity that are espoused by France, because they know these things are not true. They are hypocrisies and lies. Interestingly, it is in Ho Chi Minh, for example, in France in 1920, becomes part of the emergent French Communist Party. But he realises in 1920, in the early 1920s anyway, whilst in France, that even the Communist Party in France will still prioritise the concerns of white European party members in trade union disputes over those of Asian or African party members or French citizens. So even there, he sees that the French labour movement is still tainted by this racism, and this is one of the factors that for Ho Chi Minh and a generation of people like him, galvanise them to become part of an anti-colonial struggle. Anti-colonial struggles don't simply, appear out of holes in the ground. They have to come from the actions of the centre, the the tacit deal between coloners and colonised, unless it is based on, sort of like, an almost kind of genocidal violence, which it very rarely is really with empire. There has to be all sorts of kind of spoken and unspoken colonial reciprocity, arrangements, noblesse oblige, I do for you, you do for me. When those kinds of things break down, or when the promise given by the colonizer appears to be a fraud, then you get people gravitating towards really quite risky anti-colonial struggles. And France views rules in Syria, in Algeria, and in Indochina in the 1920s, particularly, with huge violence. They essentially conquer Syria with enormous bloodshed. Faisal, son of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, declares himself king of Syria and is chased out by the French, and in 1924 finds friends with the British, I think helped by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and is declared King Faisal of Iraq instead. He's a very useful person for Britain and France's feuding in the Middle East. By the way, if you haven't read it, read A Line in the Sand by James Barr, which is a brilliant discussion of this kind of hidden history of horrendous backbiting and sabotage and immense hypocrisy and hatreds between the British in Iraq, Palestine and Transjordan, and the French in Lebanon and Syria. There is a kind of a key change in French attitudes in the mid-1920s. In the French government and colonial circles, the idea that this policy of raising kind of these évolus to the standard of French citizenship is seen as a kind of a weak and ineffective way of ruling the empire. Instead, allied really with almost the kind of like the pseudoscience of ethnography, it's decided that local ethnic power structures need to be courted instead. So instead of going and making your own good little Frenchmen who will, be your administrative rulers in the way that you want, go and find the tribal leaders, the village chiefs, and the religious leaders in places like Syria or Indochina, and use them to carry out colonial rule. This switching policy again angered the évolus. They had bought into what the French imperial authorities had proposed. If you become educated, if you work hard, and if you are loyal to France, you will go up the social strata. And as they were doing this, they very often did look down on their less civilized and less westernized contemporaries who remained immersed within their native cultures. And it was a bit of a shock to them when there was a change in policy that started to favour these the local ethnic power structures and local leaders who were seen as good little kind of imperial helpers at the end of the day. This policy shift doesn't help to hold the French Empire together. The French Empire is still enormously shaky. And part of the reason for that, and the reason why the British Empire during the interwar period, whilst at its height, is still at its most shaky, is these huge economic and political crosswinds that they're both facing. You've got the massive waves of inflation coursing through the world as a result of the aftermath of the First World War, and all sorts of new revolutionary ideas emanating from at least from Russia, if not from other centres of kind of discourse within in the Western world. So it's very, very difficult times for empire. The imperial strategy in France was was kind of developed by pro-imperial government ministers, the main one being Théophile Delcassé, and a coalition of interest groups that are loosely described as being the Empire Party. And these interest groups were traders, merchants, to some extent financiers, but really industrialists and those people that were economically connected to empire. They were getting something out of it, but also who believed that it was part of France's mission in the world. And this imperial party was a huge network of lobbyists and, again, people with financial clout, who wanted not only to see French imperial expansion, but French imperial consolidation and the internal development of the empire. So the building of infrastructure, roads, ports, harbours, telegraph lines, schools, hospitals, all these kinds of things. Partly because it made the empire stronger and more secure, but partly because these were wonderful investment opportunities. These were a great way of proposing projects, hopefully getting the government to pay for them, or the colonial government out there to pay for them, and then offering to supply the materials and do the work. So, wonderful, wonderful wheezers all round. And this is how imperial policy was steered through this, and we shouldn't think of it as a party, as like a political party, like sort of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. By party, it meant sort of group of vested interests. France is interesting in that you have this kind of paradox, and this is something that runs throughout the French Empire, and you see it a little bit in the British Empire, in that you have this notionally egalitarian state, the state that is founded firstly on the principles of the French Revolution, and then secondly on the principles of the Third Republic that came into being after the fall of Louis Napoleon in 1870, of egalitarianism, of equality. It is if there's one thing that the Third Republic is based on, it should be this notion of equality. But colonialism is an inherently anti-egalitarian practice. There is a power differential. The colonised are not treated as equals by the colonisers. You do not have colonised subject peoples in Indochina or Algeria or Syria or wherever else being able to speak with the same voice that the colonisers do. And one of the reasons for this is because France viewed itself as being a state of enlightenment, that it was founded on Enlightenment principles, it was civilization, and it was spreading a civilization to lesser peoples around the world. As the parent might educate the child. The British have a very similar paradox. Britain is a liberal parliamentary democracy, but doesn't extend that liberal parliamentary democracy to its colonies, because it patronises them and treats them as children, in essence. And you can see all this in the discourse surrounding the mandates. That there would be three kinds of mandates that could very quickly be brought to a level of self-rule, mandates that would take a while, and mandates that might be, places like the Pacific Islands that might be indefinitely left to be looked after, like as if they were wards of state. So it's interesting that these sort of this notionally liberal democracy and this egalitarian republic are capable of generating these really quite contradictory conditions in the world. It's the kinds of things you would expect from far more repressive states. But then again, if you take America in the same time period, a country based on the notions of freedom and free enterprise, and again of equality before the law. And we know that in the southern states of America, such a thing does not exist. There are specific racial laws that are written, the Jim Crow laws. So perhaps not such an aberration after all. Anyway, I hope this has been useful, and one of the things I'd like to do in the future is look a bit about what happens to the French Empire during the Second World War and the kind of the virtual civil war that breaks out across the empire during the Second World War. But I think that's a kind of a story for another time. But I hope you find this useful today, and I look forward to catching you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.